what you just said is important, because the mentality of we've always done it this way is your enemy, right? Because everything is changing. Everything is changing every day. And so if you figure out a really good way to do something today, there's no promise it's a good way to do it tomorrow, right? But if you just look at it and say, oh, we've always done it this way and it works, so don't mess with it, it costs you $100,000 to upgrade a piece of software.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Leaders in Tech, where we're shining the light on leaders in technology that are really changing this world for a better place with the people and the organizations they're leading. Today we have with us Doug. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Super happy to be here, David.
Doug, for the audience, can you give me your full name? Where do you live and where are you working at right
now? My name is Doug Hebenthal. I live in Southeast Phoenix, Arizona, a little town called Florence. And right now I am doing some advisory work for a private equity company, Linden Capital Partners. And in process of talking with one of their member companies about coming on full time. And I was at RealtyMogul, which is a startup, or not, 11-year-old startup, if you will, of a real estate investment company, which I was with until February of this year.
You know, you're funny that you mentioned 11-year-old real estate company, because startups, people think that startup is a company that starts and they get huge in 2-3 years and then they sell for millions and millions of dollars and everybody's happy, and that's not the reality.
Yeah, for sure. RealtyMogul definitely is a startup in mentality and execution, and that's not a negative thing. It's a positive thing, right? They're looking at it from, how do we best deliver the product we want to deliver? How do we get the best customer service we want? Are we staying with the times? Are we adapting to what's going on? As you can imagine, an investment company working with real estate, balancing the supply, people who are buying real estate who want investors, to demand investors who are looking for places to invest. It's a tricky thing to balance, and to find that right set of commonalities on both sides. Takes a unique strategy, and it's evolved over time, and they do a great job, and it's a super excellent company. But things like COVID, causes a big impact on the business, and inflation with rising interest rates. It's great for people who want to buy real estate, but not so great for people who want to invest. Right. So again, it's that balance.
That's true. I was with a startup that now I think it's going to 20 years old. But we actually sold in 2011. That was one of the great exits that, the Lord allowed me to have some financial stability, but still being managed as a startup, even though it has been sold twice already. It's still considered a startup. Mm-hmm. It's $100 million startup now, but still a startup. And then I think you mentioned this well, and this is not so much a podcast for business itself, but if you're a leader in technology, if you don't have business acumen, you're not going to be a good leader in technology, right?
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think that in today's day and age, everyone is a technologist. You almost have to be, with the rate of change that's happening. I mean, I was just thinking, I was thinking about this podcast leading up to it. 6-7 years ago, wow, is cloud an okay place to think about placing your business? Was an ongoing conversation. Is it safe? I know I do a better job with security than the cloud companies do, and things like that. And today, that conversation doesn't exist whatsoever, right? The real question now is, if you're not in the cloud, are you making a bad business decision, right? It's kind of like, do you have more real estate than you need? Right. In the sense, if you think about computing architecture and computing assets as being real estate, because it sort of is in a way, then, you might be over investing in something that you shouldn't be. And, so even a CEO who's of a non-technical company, right, has to be thinking of how are they delivering their product. Is it in the most efficient way? Are they spending in the most efficient way? And it's interesting. One of the companies I'm talking to right now, the conversation with the CEO is very much a partnership conversation. It's like, I'm excellent at thinking about the business we're in, thinking about the approach, thinking about the selling tactics, thinking about all of the attributes of marketing and margin, operating expense, things like that. But I'm not a technologist. You're, Doug, a technologist. Right? Can you help me as I think through all these problems as a partner, right? Not as an employee. And I think that's a really great way to think about it, because not everyone can be, a jack of all trades, and technology is changing so fast that you just can't know it all, right? So building a collection of people, let me go off on a tangent for a second and talk to you about sort of a mental model that I have. If you think about a company like that and you say, what's all the knowledge that they need to have to be successful, and you sort of draw that into a circle. And then you take the CEO, for example, and you sort of do a cut of that pie that says, what do I know? I know, right? And of the whole thing, it's a fairly small piece of the pie, right? And then you say, what do I know? I don't know. It's an equally small piece of the pie, and then what's left, right? Which is what I don't know. I don't know. And when they talk to somebody like me, my pie slices are different, right? I know what I know, but it doesn't overlap with what she knows. And what I know I don't know doesn't overlap with hers. And suddenly when you overlap them together, we cover more of what we don't know. Add in the CEO or the COO, add in the CFO, add in the employees, add in engineers. And suddenly, as you overlay, you're starting to fill in, right, that circle, and reducing the unknowns. And being someone who wants to fill the circle in is so much more powerful than someone who thinks that somehow if they don't own as much of the circle as possible, right, they're not powerful or they're not smart or whatever. It's the collection, right? Which is one of the reasons why I always say, there's no smartest person in the room. The collective intelligence is really what will drive a business forward. And that could be the business of your family, right? The business that you're working in, a nonprofit that you're helping. It doesn't actually matter. Any collective set of people will be smarter in aggregate, right, than an individual that's part of that collective.
And that's why proudful leaders never achieve anything significant, or if they do, they never give the right the right cheer to the people that help him get there. I mean, the leader is just supposed to enable that sharing of information so that your unknowns become meaningless. That's how you achieve success, right? So what you just said is so right. The collective of people is what creates the success. As long as you know how to get those people to create that culture of sharing and helping each other. And that requires a very low level of pride, isn't it?
I couldn't agree with you more. If you think about two leadership styles, kind of what I would call a hub and spoke style, where a CEO has, let's say, 10 direct reports, and they do a lot of one-on-one meetings, right? I meet with 1, 2, 3, 4, so on, versus someone who's got more of a collective style. Let's meet together. Let's talk as a team, right? In my opinion, right, you're always going to be more successful as the latter, right? Someone who's working together with the team and really doing that collective thought. Because if you're trying to hub and spoke and aggregate everything in your own mind, it's just too much information, right? It's the difference between a human being and AI, right? It's not that AI is so magical, right? But AI can never forget, so it can learn 10 million things and take them all into account. A human can take 20. So you just can't do it. And so that leadership style, right, a collective combination partnership, together, is something I very much subscribe to. And if I get into a situation with a leader who isn't that way, I don't really feel like it's going to be as successful as it could be.
You just reminded me, Doug, when I was still in corporate, and my boss introduced me the first time. This is like 25 years ago. He introduced me to the first time to this concept of the war room. And sure enough, we had a big challenge in IT, and we needed to solve it fast. So we got one of the biggest ballrooms in the building that was filled with whiteboards. And we were like 20 people there. We set up a network like this, like in 20 minutes. We had laptops, a hub. Back then we didn't have Wi-Fi as we have now so easily. And we were just brainstorming there for 3 days, and we figured it out. But we were the 20 brightest people in the department. And I was leading them, writing down their ideas. So I was just the facilitator. That's all I did. And we figured it out. And it was called the war room for those 3 days. And they knew that IT had, they had access to that room when it was like a war situation, right?
Yeah, I worked at Microsoft for many years, and the group that would sort of march a product out the door, we held what we called daily war, which was precisely what you're describing, right? A group of people, reviewing what was fixed, what's broken, what needs to be fixed, when are we trying to launch, and managing that. And Microsoft was just part of the culture. It was called war, right? You're going to the war room, you're going to war. Outside of Microsoft, that was always like a little bit of people like, really? That seems awfully, harsh, right? But the intention wasn't that it was a battle, right? The intention was it was the focus, the energy, the strategy, right? Which was important.
It's beautiful. Doug, talking about Microsoft, let's talk about your past. I'm interested to know how you got to where you are, because you have gotten pretty far in your career. Did you go to computer science school, or how do you get into technology to begin with?
It's funny. My dad worked at IBM, and my neighbor across the street, who sort of was my surrogate dad, my parents split when I was pretty young, also worked at IBM. So I always had a real fascination with computers. And when I was about 16, the neighbor across the street who worked for IBM and I got together and we built a little mini computer. It kind of was in those days, but an original PC, 8088, IBM PC clone, basically. And that literally enabled me to go to college, because I have two personal problems. One, I'm a horrible writer. I'm left-handed and no one can read my chicken scratch. And two, I'm a horrible speller. And so having a word processor on a computer that allowed me to be able to print things and also would check my spelling was hugely important. And so I became, just from the very beginning, I was going to go into computer science. Truth be told, I went to Ohio State right out of high school to be a computer science major. And if you think about that time frame, it was 1981. Computer science was really about transistors, hardware. And that, to me, was too much.
To build logical diagrams. Remember the logical diagrams that they turn into boards afterwards? I took a couple of courses because I went to computer science in the 80s too.
And I decided that wasn't actually what I wanted. It was almost too geeky for me. And so I changed more of a programming major. So I ended up going into information sciences, information service. So I have an IS degree as opposed to a CS degree. And started out with a company called Owens Corning Fiberglass, construction products company. And we had about 250 people in the IT group there. And there were 4 of us who all came out of college the same year, who were the PC team. And then everyone else was either a mainframe or a COBOL programmer. And we literally were building networks because we couldn't run any more coaxial cables to run cluster controllers to connect people with dumb terminals. The facility didn't support it anymore. And so networks was like, oh my gosh, how are we going to get people to the mainframe? Because it wasn't about a PC, it was about getting to the mainframe. Mm-hmm. And so I started doing a lot of networking work, which brought me to a relationship with Microsoft. Early days for them, they weren't selling networking yet, but they were OEMing it to third parties. 3Com, Unger and Bass were big names back then. And eventually Microsoft recruited me to come work with them. as a systems engineer. And so I became a Microsoft employee in 1991.
So it's interesting because you went into more programming so that you could do more of the soft stuff, and you ended up building networks anyway.
It's funny, isn't it?
Yeah.
And then I ended up building software. So I was at Microsoft as a system engineer, and eventually I moved to Redmond, became part of product groups. And the first big set of technologies I worked on was internet technology. So in my early days, it was about how do we sell Windows NT as a valid server platform for internet services. Because back in the day, it wasn't anything but Unix, right?
Yeah.
It's Unix, Linux. In fact, the early days of even Linux then. And then we spent a lot of energy building a web service and a proxy service. Then we spent a lot of energy putting it into the service, into the server platform. So it just became part of Windows.
So you were responsible for IIS?
I was, in fact, one of the very early members of IIS. That's correct.
That's amazing. It's incredible. By the way, I know that this is a technical podcast, but for the business crowd, IIS stands for Internet Information Server, and is the solution that Microsoft built to compete with Linux and Unix, right?
And the interesting thing is, for us, it was much less about an application server as it was a content server, and it was all about fast, right?
Yeah.
So we focused a huge amount of energy on performance. I remember back in the early days of Microsoft and Windows NT, Dave Cutler, was running the Windows NT team, and Jim Altman was running the Windows division. And we would have meetings with Jim and Dave, and we would get into deep level code reviews about performance, and could we do more to get faster performance? And it was super interesting at that time, because I learned a tremendous amount about both leadership, and what it meant for them to be part of the business on a day in, day out basis. And also, what it meant to be frugal in your coding, right? Like I always say, some of the absolute best programming ever was in 64K, right? Because you had to be efficient, you had to make great prioritization. So, lots and lots of memory doesn't help you be a better programmer, it helps you be lazy.
Right.
So we really focused on that. And so, yeah, we built IIS and what was called at the time the Internet Proxy Server, which was basically the server that take you out to the internet. All that got incorporated in Windows NT with the Windows NT option pack, which, super arcane Microsoft trivia, right? Then this word Xbox came up. And the guy who I'd worked with for a long time on the internet technologies was going to go lead a team to build this home gaming console, code-named Xbox. It was never intended to be called Xbox. It just, by the time we got around to naming it, de facto, it was Xbox. And there were 7 of us that started that project in 1999 and built that into what it is. By the time we launched Xbox 360, it kind of set the tone for what that business was going to be.
I find always interesting that Microsoft always gets a little bit later to the ball game, but they end up winning, right?
It's a conscious strategy in many ways.
Right.
It's like you don't have to be the first, but you have to be the best.
Yeah.
And Microsoft is a sort of an elephant, if you will, right? It's like when they start a project, they're going to keep going, right? They're not going to be super fast at it, right? But they're going to plod along and work really, really hard at it. And it's always been a culture there if you're going to do it right, and don't lose focus. And Xbox was interesting, right? Because we were a bunch of heretics. If you think about it, like the company was built on a bunch of heretics, right? Who were building these PCs and these PC operating systems and PC programming languages, and that was crazy in the day. And then here, by that point, like when I started in 1991, there were 8,000 employees. That's all. But at this point, now it's 1999. It's like 8 years later, we were probably 60 to 80,000 employees.
That's fast growth, eh?
But we were the heretics now, right? Like this whole idea that it wasn't a PC. We were building some gaming console. It booted really fast. There was no, you know, there wasn't the idea of Windows on top of it. It didn't have a word, who are you guys and what are you doing? And we fostered that as well, because we wanted to not be Windows, right? We couldn't be Windows and survive.
Too slow, right?
Exactly. We in the early days, it was funny because Sony, of course, was our major competitor, right? We wanted to really take on Sony in the living room. And that was the thing that really got the project approved, because Bill felt at that time like Sony was a threat. Like Sony could take over our business, like they take over the home. We're like a computer on every home kind of a company. Like what would happen? And so we had these early games where a bunch of us were playing games all the time. I can tell you some really funny stories about Jay Allard, who was the guy I'd worked with for so long, and another guy, Cameron Ferroni, and myself. Early days, just playing Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. That had just come out on PlayStation. It was this really fantastic game. And we would play.
I remember that. I remember playing that game with my son on PlayStation.
In fact, my career at Microsoft and with Xbox led me to actually meet Tony Hawk later, because he had this game on Xbox, and we got a chance to actually meet him. That was super cool. But when we started actually getting together and playing as a group, this mantra, right, started to come out. And Jay would say it all the time. It's like, are we playing yet? Are we playing yet? Because with PlayStation, it would take forever, right? You'd put a disc in the machine, and you'd hear it kind of crunching along, and it'd boot up, and there's all kinds of screens and stuff. And it was like 40, 50 seconds, a minute and a half before you even could get to like, I want to play the game. And so that was one of the things that drove the early Xbox, was like fast, right? Boot fast, get the game up fast, get people playing fast, get involved in that experience as soon as possible. So it became sort of a mantra for us. Are we playing yet? And that was kind of the culture at the Xbox team, right? It was, what's the thing that we're going to focus on maniacally, and just do it really, really good. We don't have to do everything, right? But we have to do certain things really, really well.
And that's going back to the startup mentality that we were talking about at the beginning, right?
Exactly, right? When you and I talked a while back about doing this podcast, one of the things I said to you was, if you're starting a business, the first thing to forget is you hope to sell it someday.
Yeah.
As you'll make all the wrong decisions. You'll make suboptimal decisions about what to focus on, what to prioritize. Because what you really need to do is build a great company, have great technology, build something someone wants to buy, not build something you want to sell. Yeah. And that was the mentality. It's like, we're gonna build the best. We're gonna. I'll edit myself and say, kick Sony's butt. We probably didn't say it like that, but that was the goal, right? It wasn't to build some great business. One of the mentalities that Microsoft struggled with in those later years was, if it wasn't $1 billion business, there's no bother, right? Like, why would we bother? But you can't build $1 billion business from scratch, right? You don't know what's going to be $1 billion business. No one knows. So it's like, build the best darn thing we can, and let's see what happens. And for us, the original Xbox, we made a lot of mistakes, and mistakes that were expensive, but we viewed it as pre-season, right? It's like, this is us learning what it means to be in this business, like what it means to have a first party and a third party for gaming, what it means to build hardware, what it means to think about the evolution of cost structure, because the gaming business was substantially different than PC business. With PCs, you kind of had a set price. A laptop cost $2,000, and every year a laptop cost $2,000, but it was better, faster chips, better memory. Whatever was improving, and the price point was what you were shooting for. Exactly inverse with game consoles. Your specs stayed the same for the life of the console, and your price was constantly being cost reduced. Right? So it was all about, like, how do you take the best advantage of what you got?
Right.
and then, but things became really important because that meant early machines were really expensive and later machines were a lot less expensive. And so things like filling the channel at the appropriate rate was really important, right? Because if you put too much out too soon and your inventory turn was too low, then you're wasting a lot of money. So we had to learn about that. Like, who at Microsoft knew that?
It's a completely different business model. I mean, like, Microsoft was to write software, not build hardware to begin with.
Yeah, and what happened in the early days? You build a piece of software, you get it until it's done, right? You had the golden disk, you shipped it, and you left for 2 months, right? That's it worked. And then when you came back, you started the next version. And I'm going to build that next golden disk. Xbox changed that utterly, completely, because it was like the moment you shipped, you just started. Like the whole business changed. Like we got the thing done, and we were working with silicon, hardware and software. So at some point, silicon gets frozen, and we would laugh because bugs would become features. Right? Well, that hardware bug just became a feature. Now we have to go support that feature in the software. Right. And then the whole idea that, hey, this thing's connected, so we can actually ship an update after it ships. Huh? What are you talking about? Right? Like, nowadays this is all massively common, right? But in those days, no one understood it, right? And we were making up as we went along. And Xbox Live just drove that home even more, because you literally had a live service now that was running all the time. And new games would come on, and you may have to fix something to make sure that game worked, or the game had to get fixed to make sure it worked. And every game had to run on every console, and every console had to run every game. Right? That was the mantra. And so compatibility, even if you changed hardware, compatibility was important.
It's incredible that you mentioned that when you realized that you could actually update software, even though it has been shipped, because around 2020, I was hired to lead a team for the new point of sale system for the largest telecommunications company in Canada, and we have stores all over the place, physical stores selling all their products, and so we were deploying this thing and a large team, and it was every time that we had to send an update to upgrade the software on all these stores across the country. It was $100,000 per upgrade.
I totally get
it. So if you had a minor bug fix, $100,000. So because somebody had to go to the store and put in the disk and do the upgrade and make sure everything worked. So they called me in. The VP calls me and says, "David, can you help on this? How can we fix this?" And I'm like, well, we're the largest telecommunications company in Canada, right? And he said, yeah. Do we own the ISDN lines? Yeah, we do. Okay, let me figure something out. I mean, it was an ISDN line, right? People, back then it was like the Taj Mahal, but how much are we talking about? I don't even remember how slow it was, but it was pretty slow still, right?
That's important, right? I mean, what you just said is important, because the mentality of we've always done it this way is your enemy, right? Because everything is changing. Everything is changing every day. And so if you figure out a really good way to do something today, there's no promise it's a good way to do it tomorrow, right? But if you just look at it and say, oh, we've always done it this way and it works, so don't mess with it, it costs you $100,000 to upgrade a piece of software.
So and because the software was fairly new, they had to do that once a week, sometimes twice a week, or they couldn't sell, right?
Yeah, I go back to, I won't mention the company, but a very large consumer products company in the US was one of my customers when I was in my very early days of Microsoft as a system engineer. And this was the early days of networking and the early days of email, all of the stuff that we just take for granted now. But this company they bought an email hook, line, and sinker, and they built their own version of email on an IBM mainframe. And at this point, the company had grown so much and the email had grown so much, they had a dedicated IBM mainframe running nothing but email.
Internal email.
Internal email. You think about the cost of that, right? And it was because that's the way they did things, right? I mean, they were very steadfast. We're very smart in what we do, and we know how to do it, and that works. And so that's what we're doing. And we're literally spending hundreds of millions of dollars on running email. And you can get caught up in that mentality, right? Yeah. And opposite end of the spectrum, I've done a bunch of nonprofit work, and one of the companies I worked with, one of the nonprofits I worked with was a very, very awesome group that would provide Christmases for families that weren't going to have a Christmas. So working poor, or somehow, dad had to move away, or whatever had occurred. They just, no presents were coming. Heck, there wasn't even going to be a tree. And what we would do is we would find those people, and we would find out about their children and what they were interested in. We'd find out about the parents, and we would make a Christmas for them. We would deliver it. We had Santas and elves, and we would deliver them. And one of the things we did for every kid was every kid got a bike, and every kid got a coat, right? And there was some other stuff too. But on the coats, we would buy thousands of coats, right? And they were pretty much all the same, but size different. There's one for little boys and one for bigger boys, one for little girls and one for bigger girls. And someone in that warehouse would unwrap every coat and hang it up. And then when the people who were wrapping the gifts would come over and pick the coat for the kid based on size and color, right? And go wrap it. So I got involved, and I'm like, why do we unwrap the coats? Why don't we just have one example of one of each? And when someone says, oh, I need the blue and medium for a boy, they just pick the wrapped one, right? From the sample, because then they'll save all kinds of time. Oh, we don't do it that way. Well, why not? We unwrap them and we hang them. But we can say, no, we don't do it that way, right? You laugh, right? It's like, it's so absurd. It's funny, but yet I see corporations doing that all the time.
Yeah, because that's why you have to think outside the box, and that's why it's so important to bring people from the outside to look inside. For myself, I was always hired because I was the shaker, the tree shaker. I will go in and try to figure out how to make things better. So in this case, with these software updates, it took us 30 days to write a system. I decided, okay, based on all I had, what's the fastest way that I can do it for the line? And so we wrote a customized FTP server inside the entire private network. And all we will have to do is put a text file. So all I had to do was a text file with an on and off switch. So the software at the store will wake up at 12 a.m. every day, 12 p.m. every day, and look at that piece of software. If the text file had an on switch, it will go and download the update from the FTP server by itself. And then it will actually automatically install everything so that the next morning when they showed up, everything was up and running. And it was millions of dollars saved. Yeah. You know how much they were thanking the team,
Exactly. And that's a great example of, it doesn't take a massively complicated solution. Right?
No.
Complicated solutions aren't typically the best solutions, right? Simple, easy solutions. I was reading this sci-fi book, and it was interesting because they basically wanted to take control of this computer, and they couldn't. The security was very tight on it, right? So they couldn't quite figure out how to do it. But there was this thing they called library files, which were files that were just read into the system, kind of like your on-off switch, right? And it set constants. And so every time the computer would basically go to do something, it would read in the library file of constants, it would validate it, and it would say, okay, now I know the way the world is, and it goes on. Well, so their attack became change the constants. That file's not protected because no one thinks anyone would ever hack it, right? But by changing the constants, it's going to cause the math to fail. And when the math fails, the computer's going to say something's wrong and shut down, and then we're going to be able to get in. And sci-fi book, right? And it was some author's idea, but you think to yourself, wow, that could work, right? Computers do exactly the same thing again and again and again. And if you confuse them about what that thing is, unpredictable results will happen. And it always struck me as that's an interesting point, right? Like, what are the things that people don't think about?
Mm.
Because there's lots of them, right? And I call a lot
That's,
of those, I call those things the seams,
and
right?
that's, and you describe the ability of a great test engineer. They go at the software in a way that nobody would expect.
You're right. When we were doing, one of the things I did in the early Xbox days was I did game testing. I ran the certification program for all the game testing because any game that was going to go on Xbox had to be tested by Microsoft before it could get approved. And we had guys that we called sprinters, right? And what they did is just try to get through the game beginning to end as fast as possible. Couldn't the game be completed? Because game completion was a requirement. Like if you shipped a game that you couldn't complete, it can't ship. But then we had people who were just what we call them wanderers, and they would literally just wander and walk into walls and do things that they weren't supposed to do, and the number of times that they would find weird problems where you could get yourself into an unrecoverable situation was tremendous, because exactly what you're saying, right? You just they were testers testing things that people didn't think anyone would ever try, and yet when they tried them, bad things happen. And so you have to think about that, right? I mean, often I mentioned this a second ago, but it seems right, but just to even talk about like a cloud system, you got your three-tier architecture, right? You got your user experience, your compute and your data. Like that transition from data into compute, and that transition from compute into experience, right? No one's paying much attention, right, to those transition lines. That's where problems can occur, right?
Yeah.
So offsetting people, right, and saying, yes, you focus here, here, and here, but you're going to focus here and here, right? Because we're not going to let those seams impact us.
And also unexpected user behavior. Like, I remember when I became a professional software engineer, I wrote the system in a way that people needed to use it. But the minute you put it in somebody else's hand, they will do all kinds of different weird things that will break the system.
100%. You can't ever predict what a user's actually going to do. That's probably the ultimate axiom of computer science, right? Like you don't know. So that was my career at Microsoft. I did do some time on Halo. I was the executive producer on Halo for a while. And as part of that, we built likely the first ever true Azure application. Because of course we were inside of Microsoft, so we had much better access than people outside of Microsoft. And when we took over that game from Bungie, because Bungie had been divested, started their own company up, but Microsoft kept Halo. At that point, I took over the whole backend infrastructure of Halo. It was literally an OS2 server, A1 OS2 server that was scaled by buying a bigger and bigger and bigger piece of hardware. And so we said, okay, this isn't going to work, right? And so we ended up building an Azure cloud-based backend infrastructure for Halo, and super fun, and became like I said, one of the very first Azure apps. Really drove the Azure team to think about us as a client, the things we needed to have, and no one really ever knew that was going on because it wasn't a selling point of the platform, right? It was just the gameplay, the game itself is, but that was hugely fun. But that was pretty much the last thing I did at Microsoft before I went to Amazon, actually.
I was going to say, like, Amazon came up with this whole cloud solution idea, and they went like years before Microsoft. And then Microsoft all of a sudden comes with Microsoft Azure. I'm like, what? And now, like, so I run several IT companies. One of them is a software solutions company. We build custom tailored applications. And we went all in with Amazon. And then Azure came. And of course, some of our clients wanted to see if we could do Azure. And I couldn't believe how similar it had gotten, how easier was with Azure after just a couple of years.
Yeah, when I worked at Change Healthcare back in like 2014, 15, 16, we were building a bunch of Azure technology at the time, kind of a lot of onboarding. So when teams inside the company wanted to do a cloud app, they could simply just onboard using our technology, which would do things like set up the account, set up the security, all that stuff. So they didn't have to worry about that, because that's where people screw up, right? That's when they leave with security holes and things. And but the CEO was like, hey, I don't want to be single sourced on one cloud. Like, let's review, all the cloud solutions at the time, which, pretty much meant AWS and Azure and maybe Google, right? Dell would say they had a cloud and Oracle would say they had a cloud, but they're all very product specific to what they wanted to sell you.
Yeah.
And it really became very clear at that time, and this is not, again, technology changes so fast, it's not still true, but at that time, Amazon was sort of like the general purpose cloud. Like, anything you wanted to do in the cloud, you could sort of do there. Azure was kind of like the Microsoft cloud. And I don't mean that because Microsoft provided it, but like if you were into Active Directory, if you liked Windows, if you were using Office, like then their cloud made a lot of sense, right? And they were great at that. And so like, don't do Active Directory on AWS. I mean, you can, right? But while you're an Active Directory shop, Azure is probably where you want to be. And Google was just like, they didn't do almost anything good but analytics and search, right? Their cloud was like, if you want great analytics, man, there it is, right? If you want, great search, great, awesome. You want general purpose compute, breaking down storage and compute and, services for anything you want to do. Yeah, that wasn't the right platform for you. But, I think Microsoft's come a heck of a long way, arguably. If you include their M365 business with Azure, they're the largest cloud company now. They're still.
Like I tell you, like they go late in the game on purpose and then they win.
Exactly. And the guy who runs that whole business, a guy named Scott Guthrie, super smart person. That IIS team we talked about a little bit ago, we hired him on that team in 1997 or 8, right out of college from Duke.
Wow.
And super smart guy, always thought he could do great things at Microsoft. And, now he runs most all of the services-based business at Microsoft he's in charge of. So,
Doug, we run out of time. I can't believe it. And I knew that it was going to happen. I'm going to ask you to come back for a second episode because we're not even halfway of your career. And it's so interesting. I have so much more to say because our careers are so similar.
Yes.
For example, I went into computer science because I didn't want to use a typewriter because I'm left-handed and my orthography is horrible, right? And nobody can read my writing. and also I need to pass a typewriting exam. And for me, it was ridiculous to start all over the pages because I made one mistake. So when my uncle showed me my first text editor, I'm like, I want to learn how to do that.
Computing, it was so magical in those early days.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it was just magic, like the stuff you could do. When you think back now, right now, there's myself like, this thing is thousands of times more powerful than those computers we used back then. And, 10,000 more times more functional. But like back then, it was just crazy cool.
I know, it's beautiful. I'm a man of faith. I follow Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior. And I believe that he wrote a book about me before he created me. And sure enough, if you look at my life and you look at everything that I have done in computer science, it's been just a blessing. I was talking with another CIO just before you, and we were commenting how beautiful it is that since you start programming, you get help for free from anywhere in the world. When I became a professional programmer, it was in 1995. I know I was getting stuck at work, and somebody else from another country that I didn't know where they were answering, they were answering my specific questions, and they will get me unstuck with. Back then there was news, remember the news servers where it was like an organized email?
Absolutely.
That's, now we have Stack Overflow and all that stuff, but before it was that. But that community of helping each other unconditionally, and that's why I enjoy to be here, and that's why I keep enjoying this podcast. So I'm going to get you back next time. I want to respect your time. I'm going to, let's do part number 2 because we're halfway through. And thank you for your time, Doug. And I'll get you back in the next episode.
David, I thank you. I really appreciate it. We'll love to come back and talk more about this because it's so much fun. And quite literally, we haven't even got out of Microsoft yet.
I know. And there's so much to talk about.
David, you have a great afternoon. I really appreciate the invitation and talking to you. It's been super fun.
Wonderful, Doug. Have a blessed rest of the week. Cheers.
Thank you for tuning in to the Leaders in Tech podcast. Check in next week to keep learning how to use technology and leadership to change the game. See you next time.